Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that all, in their own way, fall into the category of ghost stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their light bulbs with light bulbs that flicker. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One night in April of 1919, a middle-aged man named Eric Marth woke up in his bedroom in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because his entire bed was shaking. He saw his wife, Margaret, was lying next to him and she was thrashing around and gasping for air. But Eric didn't panic because he knew exactly what was happening. So Eric and Margaret had moved into this house just a few weeks ago. But pretty much right away after moving in, Margaret had begun having these very intense nightmares that would wake her up almost violently, like what was happening right now. Now, from Eric's perspective, these nightmares she was having looked horrifying, but there really was not any physical risk to Margaret. I mean, she would just have these horrible visceral dreams and kind of shake around, but that was it. And so, like he had been doing the past couple of weeks, Eric just reached over and gently put his hands on his wife's shoulders and began repeating her name very gently over and over again to try to kind of get her out of this trance she was in. And sure enough, a moment later, Margaret, who kind of stopped flailing, she let out this huge gasp, and then she sat up straight and panted for air, and she turned to her husband and she said, "I saw the ghost again." And when Eric heard this, he wasn't like, "Oh my goodness, there's a ghost." Instead, he was just kind of annoyed. And so he did his best to comfort her, but he's just thinking, what in the world is going on here? So a few years ago, Margaret had joined the spiritualism movement, which was a very popular religious movement at the time. And spiritualists thought they could contact the dead. Now, Eric absolutely did not believe in ghosts, and he was pretty sure that Margaret's staunch belief in spiritualism was now effectively causing these nightmares. That it was not the house, it was just her belief system. It was kind of manifesting in these nightmares. However, Margaret felt the opposite. She felt like it was the house itself that was haunted. And it was haunted by a vengeful spirit that attacked her every night in these dreams. Now, Eric, it's the middle of the night, he's tired, he's annoyed. He didn't feel like discussing whatever she believed about this ghost right now. So after she said, "I saw the ghost, I saw the spirit again," he just told her to, calm down, go back to sleep. But on this night, Margaret didn't lie down. She actually turned to Eric and she said, "No, I have to figure out what's going on. I have to figure out who this ghost is and why they're haunting me." A week later, a very resigned Eric sat at his kitchen table next to Margaret, and across from them sat a medium, which is a person who spiritualists believed could talk directly to the dead by conducting a ritual called a seance. The medium began to light some candles, and as they did, they told Eric and Margaret to close their eyes because she was ready to begin the seance, where she would ask the spirit haunting their house what it wanted, and they needed, silence and their eyes closed to do that. So Eric fully believed that this seance would be a waste of time and money. He didn't believe in this stuff at all. But he knew his wife did, and it meant a lot to her. And so he's thinking, maybe this can help my wife sleep through the night again. And so Margaret and Eric did as they were told. And Eric, he closed his eyes and he listened as the medium began clearly rocking back and forth in her chair and began sort of dramatically calling out to the ghost and telling him to reveal himself. And at first, nothing happened, which was exactly what Eric had expected. But after a minute, Margaret suddenly jumped up from the table and ran out of the kitchen across the living room. And Eric, not knowing any better, just got up and followed her. And Margaret, she ran down the hallway and she threw open a door that led down to their cellar, and she raced down the steps. Now, Eric was doing his best not to ridicule what was happening here and just to play along. But it's like, what is his wife doing? What's happening here? And so as he's chasing after his wife, he starts saying like, "Honey, what's going on here? Where are you going? What is this?" But she didn't respond. It was like she was on a mission. And then finally, when Eric got down the steps and he's in the cellar, he saw his wife, who was now standing in the middle of the cellar with her arms out wide. And slowly, she began to point to a spot on the floor. And in this really weird and hollow voice with this sort of vacant expression on her face, she told Eric to dig. At this point, Eric was totally freaked out. Not because he believed that the seance had worked or that there was a ghost here, but because his wife genuinely was acting totally bizarre. I mean, she was acting possessed. And even if that was an act, it was a terrifying one. And so he just said no. There was no way he was just going to start digging up the cellar floor. Like, what is going on here? But then the medium came rushing down the stairs as well. And they said that Margaret was in a trance, that the ghost in this house was channeling her, and that basically Eric had to do whatever the ghost said. Suddenly, Margaret's voice cut across the room again, and she said to Eric to dig up the floor. And this time she was more forceful and almost desperate, like, you must do this. And so Eric, he's looking at his wife, he's looking at the medium, like, what in the world is happening here? But he's like, you know what? I don't know what's happening. I'm just gonna dig. I'm gonna do what they tell me to. And so he grabbed a shovel and just began digging up the cellar. And after just a few minutes, Eric's shovel hit something in the ground, something hard. He thought it was just maybe like a big rock or something. But a few minutes later, after he and the medium and also Margaret, who's now come over at this point, they'd kind of cleared off whatever it was, they saw in the ground, what had previously been covered by the earth, was this rotten wooden box. And so he and Margaret and the medium, they pulled it out of the hole and they opened up the lid. And all three of them immediately recoiled because inside of the box was a human skeleton. And so after a minute of just, again, stunned silence, Eric just looked up at Margaret, who did not seem shocked by what she was looking at. This was like confirmation in some ways. And he says to Margaret, is this the skeleton of the ghost that's been haunting you? And Margaret, with that same hollow voice, like it wasn't her voice, looked at Eric and just said, no. It would turn out, according to the story that has been passed down about whatever happened in this house, that the ghost was a doctor who used to live in the house that Eric and Margaret moved into. And 18 years earlier, this doctor had performed an illegal surgery on a young woman, and this woman had died during this procedure. But again, because this surgery had been illegal, the doctor knew if word of what happened here got out, he would be arrested. So what did he do? He dismembered the girl's body and shoved it into this wooden box, filled the box with quicklime, and then he buried it in his basement. And amazingly, the doctor never got caught for what he did. And so he basically spent the rest of his life feeling very ashamed and guilty. And then finally, when he did die, it was like his spirit couldn't actually rest until he confessed. And so this haunting was basically to get Margaret to go down into the basement and see what he had done. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. One afternoon in April of 1925, a wealthy teenager named Lacey raced his horse around the huge estate where he lived in eastern Hungary and took in all the land that he knew he would inherit someday. He stopped when he reached the gardens on the far side of the estate, but before he could ride his horse into the gardens as he wanted to, a field worker ran up to Lacey and asked him to stop and turn around. The field worker, who was about Lacey's age, explained that Lacey was not allowed to ride his horse through the garden anymore because the last time he had rode through some flower beds and Lacey's father was really mad about it. And at this, Lacey felt totally exasperated because he was tired of his father always bossing him around. And it embarrassed him to be reminded of this by someone as low class as a field worker. So Lacey's family was part of the noble class. His dad was a baron, his mother was a baroness, and they lived together in an old castle on this beautiful estate. And for the most part, Lacey loved his noble life, but his father could be harsh and really controlling. And sometimes Lacey dreamed of the day that he would inherit his dad's title, because then he, Lacey, would be in charge of the estate and he could finally run things the way he wanted. And so Lacey decided he wanted to show his father and this field worker and the other field workers that they couldn't order him around all the time. And so he rode his horse right into the gardens and intentionally rode all over their prized flower beds. Lacey's plan was to head back home and go into the castle and talk to his father about that field worker's rudeness. But when Lacey got back to the castle, he didn't have a chance to even speak to his father, because that whole day his dad was very busy with estate matters. And then that night, his father died of a heart attack. A week after his father's death, Lacey walked through the crowded banquet hall in his family's castle looking for his mother, because he wanted to make sure that she was okay. He and his mom had just gotten home from his dad's funeral, and now they were hosting a reception for everyone who had attended. But Lacey couldn't find his mother anywhere inside of this banquet hall. And with a sinking feeling, he realized there was only one place she could be. So after Lacey's father had died, his mother had gone a little bit crazy. She refused to believe that her husband had died of a heart attack, and instead kept insisting that he had been murdered. More specifically, she thought he had been scared to death, because when she had seen his body for the first time, his facial expression looked horrified, like he was actually scared as he died. Now, the doctor had explained to her that it was entirely possible that his heart attack came on suddenly and he was scared about what was happening to him and so, was scared when he died. But the Baroness wouldn't listen. She said this was intentional. Somebody did this to him. And so ever since, she had basically spent all of her time in Lacey's father's bedroom searching for clues about her husband's supposed killer. So now, Lacey left the banquet hall and climbed the stairs up the castle up to his father's bedroom. And just as he suspected, when he knocked on the door, his mom answered, looking totally frantic. Lacey told her to come downstairs and say hello to their guests, but she said no, that she was too busy looking for evidence. Then, before Lacey could say anything, his mom just shut the door in his face. The next 6 months went by basically the same way. Lacey's mother spent all her time locked up in the Baron's bedroom around the clock, and Lacey spent most of his time riding his horse, including in the garden, because he didn't like going home anymore. His mother was now technically in charge of the family estate, but she had really let things go since her husband had died. She basically had not taken up any of the responsibilities that she was now in charge of. And so at this point, Lacey really couldn't wait until he was on his own and in charge of the castle and the estate himself. One night in mid-October, so this is at the 6-month mark from when Lacey's father had died, Lacey ate dinner alone, which was common at this point since his mom basically still refused to come downstairs at all. And then after he ate dinner, Lacey began making his way upstairs to get ready for bed. And as he walked upstairs, Lacey just felt overcome with anger and desperation and just kind of general angst about the current situation. He longed so desperately to just be alone and in charge of the estate. He hated the current setup with his mother in charge, but not really doing anything. I mean, the whole estate was just falling apart here. But eventually, despite feeling kind of riled up, Lacey, got into bed and closed his eyes and did eventually begin to drift off to sleep. But right after he had fallen asleep, he was suddenly awoken by this ear-piercing scream that was echoing down the hallway. And he realized it was his mother, and she was screaming for help. And so Lacey jumped out of bed and he raced down the hallway to his father's bedroom. And as he ran, other servants were flooding the hallway, racing towards the room as well. And Lacey, he got to the door, he unlocked it, and he rushed inside. And when he got in there, he saw his mother pointing at the foot of the Baron's bed. And she was saying that a demon had appeared in the bedroom and had loomed over her like it wanted to kill her. And so she told Lacey that the demon had to be what scared his father to death. The demon was the murderer. Lacey's mother looked absolutely convinced here. But Lacey, and really all the servants as well, just kind of collectively sighed, because there was obviously no demon at the foot of the bed here. And his mom clearly had just had a bad dream, or, was just basically acting crazy. And so as the servants kind of, went back to their rooms to allow the family to deal with this, Lacey told his mother to just go back to sleep here. And then he turned and walked back down to his room, feeling completely defeated, because to Lacey, his mom was basically losing her mind here. and he had no idea how he was going to help, or really how much longer this current setup was going to last, but this was awful. On both of the next 2 nights, Lacey woke up yet again to the sound of his mother screaming about a demon inside of the Baron's bedroom. And so by the 3rd morning, Lacey had just had enough. He decided he was going to force his mother out of that bedroom and insist that she come downstairs and eat breakfast with him and just act normal for once. However, when he walked to the Baron's bedroom and knocked on the door to speak to his mother, it was not his mom who answered. It was a police detective. Lacey was stunned, and he walked into the bedroom and saw his mother, who was standing there with 2 more detectives. And Lacey asked, what's going on here? Lacey's mother explained that she had called the police to help her catch the demon that was haunting her at night and very likely was responsible for killing her husband. And at this point, Lacey thought he might die of embarrassment. This was unbelievable that now the police were involved. But instead of talking about that, he just begged his mother to please send the police home. They do not need to be here. But his mother refused. She was fully committed to the idea that there was a demon here and the police were going to help her find it. And the police, to be honest, looked like they didn't really know what was going on. They were just kind of trying to figure out if this was serious or not, or if there was some sort of intruder, but they were just kind of like, we'll see. And so Lacey finally just turned, left, hopped on his horse, and went for his daily ride. That night, as Lacey crawled into his own bed, he knew that down the hallway, his mom was already in bed, and that 3 detectives were watching over her room in case a demon appeared. Again, Lacey felt unbelievably embarrassed by this. To even be affiliated with this was just excruciating, but he managed to close his eyes and go to sleep. But, like normal, at some point in the middle of the night, he woke up because his mother was screaming. And Lacey, he's like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. It's only getting worse, but he got out of bed, he went into the hallway, and he began walking down towards where his mother was, where she was screaming inside of the Baron's bedroom, expecting that, once again, the room would be empty and the police would see, this is just complete delusion here. There's no demon, there's no problem. However, when Lacey got to the doorway and looked inside, he saw one of the detectives running across the room and then tackle something that really did look like a demon to the floor. And then Lacey's mother turned on the light. It would turn out that even though Lacey fully expected to inherit his father's title, he was actually not the Baron's firstborn son. Before the Baron had met the Baroness, Lacey's mother, he'd had a relationship with a local peasant woman, and they had had a son together. And the Baron had given that peasant woman a plot of land on the edge of the estate to raise their son in secret. And then the Baron had basically abandoned them both. He had given them the opportunity to, work on the estate and sort of make a living for themselves, but functionally, he didn't interact with them at all. He didn't recognize them at all. They were on their own. Now, the peasant woman, the mother of this child, had sort of accepted that this was their reality, but the secret son had sort of buried that feeling forever until Lacey rode his horse through the gardens despite being told not to and destroyed those flower beds. Because the secret son was that field worker. His job was looking out for the gardens, and it just felt like a step too far. And so the secret son, the field worker, decided he was going to teach this family a lesson. He was going to kill the Baron and the Baroness by scaring them to death. That was his plan. And it sort of worked. He went into the castle and pretended to be a demon in the middle of the night, and he scared the father, the Baron, so badly, he literally had a heart attack and died. However, the secret son continued pretending to be a demon around the Baroness after killing the Baron, and the Baroness would get really, really scared and would scream and claim there's a demon in here. But she didn't die from this. She did not have a heart attack. And so ultimately, the plan was foiled. And so in the end, there was no demon. It was just Lacey's half-brother wrapped in a cloak, wearing a horrifying mask. One morning in early August of 1927, a 24-year-old woman named Inez Perry walked in the back door of the farmhouse where her parents lived in rural Vermont. And as soon as she walked in, she went into the kitchen where her father was at the kitchen table with a man she had never seen before, and the two were shaking hands, and she heard her father say, "We have a deal." And then right after that, Inez's father looked over and saw her, And he explained that this man's name was Clarence Sinclair, and that he and Clarence had just agreed to swap houses. And for a second, Inez was confused, but then it all clicked into place. So Inez's parents had raised her and her other 3 siblings in this farmhouse, but Inez and her siblings had all moved away, and her parents were getting older. Her dad's health in particular was starting to fail, and keeping up the farmhouse was getting to be too much for him. And so her father had been trying to sell the property for a while, but nobody seemed to want it. However, now it seemed like he had finally found a solution. Her dad explained to her that Clarence and his family would move into this farmhouse and take over the farm. And in exchange, he and Inez's mom would move into Clarence's house just a few towns over. Now, to Inez, this arrangement did seem a little strange, but it also did solve her parents' problem. And so even though she was going to be sad to say goodbye to her childhood home, she decided that this had to be the right move for her parents. And so she said, that's great. A few weeks later, Inez was inside of her parents' new house, helping to get them settled in and organize their living room, when she heard the clattering sound of a horse-drawn wagon coming down the street and coming to a stop right outside. So she walked to the door and she opened it up, but the second she saw who it was that was getting out of the carriage, she slammed the door and locked it. Because the person getting out of that carriage was Clarence Sinclair, the man who Inez's dad had swapped homes with. And the home swap had not gone how Inez and her family had hoped. Inez's parents were thrilled with their new house, so everything on their side was good. But pretty much immediately after actually doing the swap, Clarence had started acting totally unhinged. He had come back to his old home repeatedly without being invited, and he would beg Inez's dad to switch houses back, that he had made a horrible mistake. But Clarence would never elaborate. He would never really explain why he felt this way. He would just, demand, please, I've made a horrible mistake. We have to switch back. But Inez's dad had said no. A deal was a deal. And he just had too many health issues to live at that farmhouse anymore. And Clarence couldn't actually cite any real problems with the farmhouse that he so desperately wanted to, give back. And so as far as Inez's dad was concerned, the subject here was closed. He had not given him a faulty property, and there was no real reason here to go back to the way it was, and so it was a no. So now Inez and her parents watched from the window as Clarence hopped out of his wagon and came rushing onto the porch. And he looked absolutely crazy. His hair was messed up and greasy, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and he really looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. And Clarence promptly began pounding on the front door, shouting that his family could not live in their farmhouse, and that this was now a matter of life and death. But eventually, when Inez and her family refused to come out, Clarence finally gave up, turned around, got in his wagon, and drove away. Now, that was the last time that Clarence came to their house. But it was not the last time that Inez and her family would hear about their old farmhouse. A few weeks later, on November 4th, after several days of very heavy rainfall, Inez picked up the newspaper and saw that their old neighborhood had been basically washed away by historic flooding. And that included their old farmhouse had literally been carried off. And the family that had been living in the farmhouse were dead. But that family was not Clarence Sinclair's family. It would turn out that after Clarence and his family had moved into said farmhouse, Clarence began having these horrible dreams where his dead mother would appear to him and tell him to move out of this farmhouse right now because something terrible is going to happen here. Now, at first, Clarence ignored this and chalked it up to a bad dream, but the dream kept happening over and over and over again. Then it was driving him mad. And so eventually, he did go to Inez and Inez's parents and tried to switch it back because he felt like this dream really meant something. But Inez's father just kept saying no and said, no, that's your house now. And so Clarence never elaborated to the family about why he wanted this back because it made no sense to him either, but he ultimately listened to his dead mother in his dream, and he wound up just selling the farmhouse just to not live there anymore. And so that decision would ultimately save Clarence and his family, but it would also condemn to death the family who moved in. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's stories are about real people who try to control fate, and what they end up doing is just causing historic levels of destruction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to reorganize the Like Button's pantry for them. But instead of actually doing that, just remove all the labels from their canned goods. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely, and there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch house had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch house became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew, really, he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. This was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him, but then eventually he turned around and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. It was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. There was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back.
The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch House where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch House, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around, and this time he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox, and after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the Willies in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the Willies were not in there either. And this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet, as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, no, we don't know where they are. And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. I mean, this was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies' property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the Willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, Well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake, because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come for money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up, and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying: the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. She just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding, and her stomach was in knots. She was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories, and she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair, and she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more. It had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards, to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Bosse was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden, because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Bosse. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. Thank you so much for watching today's episode.
Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.